If you want to understand the origins of the global financial system, like the concepts of capital, subjective value, and opportunity cost, you really shouldn't look at Wall Street bankers.
No, not at all.
You actually need to look at medieval monks. Specifically, monks who took a literal vow to own absolutely nothing.
Which is such a wild paradox.
It really is. And today, we're pulling from a fascinating historical and architectural guide to St. Bernardine and Franciscan mysticism. This is from Terry de Siena, alongside this incredibly detailed draft lecture on the history of economic thought by Dr. Christopher J.M. Hansen from Leipzig University.
It's a great paper.
Yeah, it's brilliant. And our mission for you on this deep dive is to uncover how these radical friars formulated early theories of capital and banking that basically dictate the economy you participate in today. Okay, let's unpack this.
Right. So to understand how a monk becomes, an economist, you have to look at the money they were dealing with at the time. By the 11th century, the economy of Europe was in the middle of this massive upswing. But the currency itself was, well, it was total chaos.
Total chaos is a pretty good way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Hansen's lecture details how Charlemagne originally tried to institute this strict monetary standard, right? Like 240 pennies equaled 1 pound of silver.
Which sounds very organized.
It does. But as his empire disintegrated, the central control over money just completely collapsed. The minting rights were basically alienated.
Meaning local lords and bishops and even city councils bought or seized the legal right to just print their own money?
Exactly. So you suddenly had hundreds of independent Italian city-states and European fiefdoms minting their own localized coins.
Which means the quality of the money varied wildly from town to town. Like the lecture notes that around the year 1130, if you were dealing with a denier of a town called Le Puy, it was notoriously degraded.
Oh, it was awful.
Yeah, it contained only about 19% fine silver. But then a merchant coming from Toulouse might have coins that were 83% fine silver.
So put yourself in the shoes of a merchant trading across those borders. You aren't just negotiating the price of, say, a bolt of silk or a barrel of wine.
Right, you're constantly acting as this sort of amateur forensic metallurgist.
Yes, you're constantly evaluating the actual physical worth of the metal someone is handing you. And it created a de facto currency competition.
Because the coins circulated far beyond the specific regions where they were minted.
Right. And people quickly figured out which coins held real value and which were essentially junk. They demanded the good money.
And at the same time, the merchants were getting much more sophisticated in how they tracked all this wealth, right? You eventually see the perfection of double-entry bookkeeping by Luca Pacioli.
Which was huge.
Yeah, it wasn't just a neat accounting trick. It conceptually separated a merchant's personal household wealth from the money tied up in their business. It created a framework for analyzing profit and loss objectively.
So you have this booming, highly complex, increasingly wealthy society, and right in the middle of this massive accumulation of wealth, you get a radical pushback from the mendicant orders.
Right, like St. Francis of Assisi.
Exactly.
Right.
St. Francis and his followers looked at this explosion of urban wealth and the social inequality and spiritual crisis it generated, and they went in the exact opposite direction.
They preached an ideal of absolute poverty.
Yes. They wanted to imitate Christ through a life of total nullity. They built their stripped-down churches outside the city walls in the poorest neighborhoods, and they took vows to reject wealth completely.
But the funny thing is, because they took that vow of apostolic poverty, they accidentally forced themselves into becoming legal and economic theorists.
Yeah, they really did. Because they still had to, eat bread and wear clothes to survive.
Right, but legally they couldn't own the bread or the clothes.
Exactly. So they had to figure out the exact boundary between consuming a resource and possessing it.
Which is such a granular distinction to have to make.
It forced a massive philosophical reckoning regarding the nature of private property itself. The theologian John Duns Scotus argued that private property wasn't actually a natural state of human existence.
Wait, really? What did he think it was?
He theorized that it only existed after the fall of man. In his framework, everything in the Garden of Eden was held in common.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he said private property was just a human legal construct created to manage our fallen, greedy nature. So when the monks debated how to legitimately use a piece of bread without legally owning it, they were inadvertently defining the foundational mechanics of property, use, value, and consumption.
That's wild. And that philosophical groundwork inevitably collided with the biggest practical economic problem of the era, which was lending.
Right.
A booming merchant economy trading across fragmented borders desperately needs credit, like business requires upfront capital.
Absolutely.
But the church maintained a strict, historic ban on usury charging any interest at all on a loan, which dated all the way back to the Council of Nicaea.
And the scholastic thinkers of the 13th century spent an enormous amount of energy trying to logically explain why charging interest was a sin. Dr. Hansen points to William of Auxerre.
Oh, right, his argument about time.
Yeah. He argued that charging interest was inherently evil because the usurer was essentially selling time.
Because when you charge interest, you're demanding more money simply because time has passed while the borrower held your funds.
Exactly. And to William, time belongs exclusively to God. It is a universal constant given freely to all people.
So selling time is treated as literal theft of divine property.
That was the logic, yeah.
But let me push back on that logic for a second, because this is where the scholastic arguments get kind of tricky.
Okay, go for it.
If I own a physical asset, like a plow or a horse, and I lend it to you for a month, I can legitimately charge you rent for that time.
Right.
Why was renting a plow completely acceptable, but renting money was considered evil? Both involve time passing.
That is the exact distinction St. Albert the Great tackled. He revived an old Aristotelian argument and popularized the Latin phrase pecunia non pecuniam paret.
Which means money does not breed money.
Exactly. To the medieval mind, a plow is fundamentally different from a coin. A plow is a productive tool, you use it on the earth, and it physically helps produce wheat. A horse pulls a cart, they have natural intrinsic utility.
But money is merely a measure of exchange, a dead placeholder.
Right. St. Albert even used the myth of King Midas to drive this home.
Oh, I love this analogy. Midas turns everything he touches into gold, and he starves to death because gold has no intrinsic life-giving nature. It can't be eaten.
Exactly. So exchanging a dead metal for a living necessity is fine. But treating dead metal as if it can organically grow and multiply on its own, money breeding money, is unnatural.
But lenders needed a reason to take on the risk of giving their money away for months at a time, and the economy would grind to a halt without them.
It absolutely would. So the breakthrough came from a cardinal named Hostiensis, who identified a crucial loophole in the usury ban.
The lucrum cessans.
Yes, lucrum cessans, which roughly translates to the ceasing of gain.
Okay, so if I lend you 100 silver coins, I am actively giving up the opportunity to invest those coins in a profitable merchant voyage myself.
Exactly. So Hostiensis argued that a lender could legitimately charge a fee not for the money itself, but as compensation for the profit they would have made if they had kept the funds.
That is the direct ancestor of the modern economic concept of opportunity cost. Lenders were no longer charging for the passage of time. They were being indemnified for a quantifiable missed opportunity.
Yes, but that loophole creates a massive practical problem.
Right. If I am charging you an interest rate based on my opportunity cost, who determines what that missed opportunity was actually worth?
Exactly. Without a universal theory of value and prices, lenders could just invent massively inflated opportunity costs to justify extortionate interest rates. They needed a way to define what things were truly worth.
And that is where St. Thomas Aquinas steps in.
He really does. He stepped in to answer what makes a price just. He realized that economic value cannot be based on a thing's natural dignity or its objective rank in the biological world.
Value is dictated entirely by human need and market demand.
Right.
The lecture notes include Aquinas' specific analogy, and it's brilliant. By the laws of natural dignity, a living mouse is vastly superior to a pearl.
Right, because the mouse has biological life, it moves, it has senses.
And a pearl is just an inanimate rock, yet in the marketplace, a single pearl is worth more than 1,000 mice.
Exactly. The biological superiority of the item is irrelevant. Human desire and subjective need dictate the price.
And then a 13th century Franciscan lector in Florence named Pierre de Jean Olivi took Aquinas' foundation and built something revolutionary.
He formally invented what economists now call subjective utility theory.
Wow.
Yeah, he argued that the economic utility of any good is split into two distinct parts. First is its objective capability, like, can this plow actually till the soil? But the second and more important factor for market price is the subjective desire of the individual. How desperately do you personally need that plow at this exact moment in time?
Olivi was also the first academic to formally use the concept of capital. He didn't just see money as a dead hoard of metal under a mattress. He defined capital as a specific fund of money that had actively invested in a commercial venture.
He recognized that money, when deployed in business, takes on an active quality that deserves a return.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Pierre de Jean Olivi's breakthroughs were incredibly controversial in his own time. Much of his work was officially suppressed by his superiors, and he was largely erased from the history of economic thought.
It's true. But his idea survived through a kind of intellectual smuggling operation by the main subject of our deep dive today, St. Bernardine.
St. Bernardine of Siena. He's the figure who takes all this dense academic theology out of the monasteries and injects it directly into the bloodstream of the medieval public.
Yeah, the Terre de Siena source gives us a really vivid picture of him. He was born in 1380 to a noble family in Siena, but orphaned at age 6.
And his worldview was really forged during a catastrophic plague epidemic in 1400.
Right. The 20-year-old Bernardine essentially took over the Spedale di Santa Maria della Scala, risking his life to care for plague victims and comfort the dying.
That visceral experience of mass suffering pushed him to join the Franciscans.
And he became the driving force behind the observant movement within the Franciscans. Over the centuries, the order had, relaxed some of its stricter rules regarding poverty and property.
But Bernardine demanded a return to the original uncompromising purity of St. Francis. His Latin motto explicitly called for observing the rules simply and purely.
Yet he wasn't an isolated ascetic. Bernardine was arguably one of the greatest mass communicators of his era.
He really was. He preached for 45 consecutive days in Siena's main square, the Piazza del Campo, drawing crowds so massive they couldn't fit in any church.
They even tried to make him bishop 3 times, and he turned it down every time just to maintain his freedom to preach on the streets.
His preaching style revolutionized public discourse. He relied heavily on the exemplum technique.
Right. Instead of citing obscure theological texts, he used palpable, immediate examples from the daily lives of the merchants, artisans, and poor people standing in front of him.
He would weave in current news events and local political gossip. He even used the city's own art against them.
Oh, yeah?
Pointing to Ambrogio Lorenzetti's famous fresco, The Allegory of Good and Bad Government, painted right there in Siena's town hall, to illustrate that social order and fair trade are the bedrock of peace.
He also utilized visual branding centuries before modern marketing.
Oh, the tablet.
Yeah, during his sermons, he would hold up a wooden tablet painted with the JHS monogram standing for Jesus Hominum Salvator set inside a radiant sun. It was an unmistakable visual aid that branded his message into the minds of the illiterate crowds.
So how did this charismatic street preacher become the vehicle for Olivi's suppressed economic theories?
Well, Bernardine essentially absorbed Olivi's subjective utility theory and translated it for the masses. He wrote a highly influential text called The Treatise on Contracts and Usury.
Okay.
In it, he viciously condemned predatory lending, which was devastating the poor, but he formally validated the concept of lucrum cessans, that opportunity cost for invested capital we talked about earlier.
So he publicly defended the idea that capital, when deployed properly in a business, was productive and deserved a fair return.
Exactly. He synthesized the strict moral framework of the Franciscans with the practical, daily realities of a booming financial hub.
And this wasn't purely theoretical. It had a massive, tangible outcome. By intellectually validating the ethical use of capital while simultaneously condemning predatory usury, Bernardine provided the exact theological framework needed to create the Monte di Pietà.
The creation of the Sienese Monte di Pietà in 1472 is a watershed moment in financial history.
It really is.
It was established as a solidarity-based, non-profit financial institution specifically designed to combat the local usurers who were charging exorbitant rates, sometimes 30 to 40%.
And the mechanics of how it worked are brilliant. It wasn't just a charity handing out free money, which would go bankrupt immediately.
Right.
They operated like a modern pawn shop, but with an ethical cap. The poor could bring in a physical pledge, like a piece of clothing or a tool, and receive a small loan.
And the Monte di Pietà would charge a tiny administrative fee, maybe 2 to 5%, which was carefully calculated to cover only the operational costs of the clerks in the building.
No one was making a profit.
Exactly. It was a self-sustaining pool of capital designed to provide a social safety net. It is the literal birth of ethical banking.
They used the complex economic theories of subjective value and opportunity cost to engineer a financial vehicle that protected the most vulnerable members of society.
And Bernardine's legacy is still physically woven into the fabric of Siena today. The Terra di Siena guide details the convent and basilica of the Osservanza, a hermitage just outside the city walls that Bernardine expanded.
Yeah, and if you walk inside, you will find a painting by Pietro di Giovanni d'Ambrosio.
The significance of that specific painting is that it was completed in 1444, which is the exact year Bernardine died. The artist knew him personally and had observed his preaching.
So it's an unvarnished, true likeness.
Yes, it depicts an emaciated figure with a gaunt face hollowed out by extreme fasting and a toothless mouth. You see the severe physical toll of his radical poverty captured in paint.
The monastery also serves as an archive of his physical existence. They preserve his thick gray wool habit, the light cassock he wore while walking between towns, and even a reliquary holding his precordium powders.
Which are the carefully preserved remains of the bodily tissues from around his heart.
Yeah. There is even a small reliquary at the top of an urn holding one of his teeth.
That physical devotion is mirrored in the architecture of the nearby Basilica of San Francesco, where Bernardine celebrated his first Mass.
The structure is built as a simple T-shaped cross, a tau.
Right. The interior is a vast single hall, completely devoid of columns or physical barriers between the altar and the congregation. Every architectural choice was made to ensure zero distraction from the spoken word of the preacher.
Which brings us to a frankly chilling event documented in the Siena Guide that occurred right there at the Basilica of San Francesco, the Eucharistic miracle of the sacred particles.
Yeah, this is wild. In 1730, thieves infiltrated the church and stole a ciborium containing over 300 consecrated hosts. You know, the communion wafers.
Right.
The wafers were recovered a few days later, stuffed inside a collection box covered in cobwebs and dirt. Because they were soiled, the friars couldn't consume them, so they placed them in a sealed container, expecting them to naturally decompose as any unleavened bread would.
But they never deteriorated.
They just stopped aging.
Completely.
For nearly 300 years, they have remained perfectly intact. They have been subjected to multiple scientific examinations, most recently in 2014, and the tests repeatedly confirm the inexplicable absence of any microbial growth or decay. Pope John Paul II even visited the site in 1980 to view them.
This isn't just a random ghost story appended to an economic history. It perfectly encapsulates how entirely physical their spiritual worldview was.
Right, just as they believed the divine could physically manifest and persist in a wafer of bread, they believed morality and ethics had to physically manifest in the marketplace.
You couldn't separate the spiritual health of a city from the physical mechanics of its currency.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean? We have traced a remarkable path from the chaotic, fragmented silver pennies of Charlemagne's successors, through monastic debates over the theft of divine time, to St. Bernardine utilizing subjective utility to engineer a self-sustaining non-profit bank for the poor.
The vital takeaway is that the architecture of capitalism wasn't just built by people trying to get rich.
Right.
The concepts of opportunity cost, capital investment, and subjective market value were violently debated, refined, and justified by barefoot ascetics who were desperately trying to figure out how society could survive a booming economy without losing its soul.
When you evaluate an opportunity cost at your job, or use a credit card, you're utilizing tools forged in the fires of medieval theology. They mapped the mechanics of greed so they could build guardrails against it.
Yeah, that's incredibly true.
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over. If Aquinas and Livy were right, that market value isn't based on a thing's natural dignity, but is entirely driven by subjective human need and desire, what would these medieval friars think of our modern economy?
Oh, that's a great question.
If they walked into a modern financial hub, what would they make of purely digital assets, or highly speculative markets, where the need isn't for physical sustenance, but is a psychological desire entirely manufactured by the market itself? Would they view it as the ultimate triumph of subjective utility? Or would they see it as a return to the unnatural hunger of King Midas, starving amidst his own gold? Something to think about the next time you check your portfolio.